All right, so this is a workshop about breaking down the GCC, the Gnostic Celtic Church communion ritual. It's a ritual that has been sort of the core of the ritual practice for GCC over its relatively short tradition, but it's also one that sometimes there's a lot of confusion around or just misunderstanding about it, what it does and how it functions and things like that. So we wanted to really have this workshop so that we can talk about the GCC communion ritual, how it kind of relates to similar rituals and the tradition of this type of ritual throughout history. And then we can also get into how the specific mythology works that's and symbolism works that's used within the GCC communion ritual as it's written and what the kind of core mechanics of that are so that you can then take that and whether you're doing it as written and you'll have a new understanding of what some of the symbols might mean and what some of the elements of the ritual are, or if you want to take an entirely different mythology, an entirely different symbol set, or an entirely different culture or tradition and apply those same mechanics to it, you can really make the communion ritual something that is specific to you and it's specific to your practice, your theology, your personal law. So that's going to be essentially what we're accomplishing here today. So we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit first. I'll let Claire go first.
Hi, everybody. I'm Claire Schosser, and I am the Archdruid of Water. I've been the Archdruid of Water since I've been an Archdruid, but I started as Archdruid of Fire in fall of 2019, and I believe I picked up Water then in spring of 2020. I joined AODA in late 2012, and I've got the Ovate Adept degree. I have also joined GCC in, I believe it was early 2021, and last fall, Jack named me a bishop. And I'm also in, since the Universal Gnostic Church will get mentioned, I'm also a bishop in the Universal Gnostic Church now that is actually being revived separately from AODA. So, Jack, your turn.
All right, so I'm Jack Campbell. I'm the Archdruid of Fire currently. I'm also the preceptor of the Gnostic Celtic Church. And I have been in AODA for several years. If I would have known that Claire was going to name years, I probably would have done more preparation in terms of figuring that out. But it seems like it's been a long time. I am a Druid adept, and my I'd say my interests and my backgrounds are very much along the lines of cult philosophy, magic, ritual practice, and things of that nature, mysticism. So I am in a number of different orders, and from OBOD and ADF and the Anglican Druid Order, Druidical Order of the Golden Dawn. I'm a Freemason. I'm a and the Theosophical Society in America. But all of these are really about essentially a common background of finding ourselves, finding the divine within ourselves, and that's kind of, I guess, my major interest is kind of finding what that is in a cross practice background and how that's been addressed in various cultures and various traditions. So while we're here, we're going to talk about, like it mentions, the history of communion and some similar rituals throughout history. Um, we'll get down to the basics of it, but also we're going to talk about some examples of how other people within GCC are practicing it right now. And in some of those cases, the ritual itself is extremely different than what is written, and that's totally cool. In fact, whenever we redo the clergy guide, we're planning on having some examples with those people's permission so that other people can see how they've modified the ritual and made it their own. So GCC actually began as a nature-based offshoot of the Universal Gnostic Church and was developed in 2010. So we're not talking about some ancient tradition that's above reproach, cannot be changed, cannot be modified. In fact, this the practices that we have within the manual have gone through changes. The original manual was written by John Michael Greer. It was a reflection of how he practiced things, and the new manual has stuff in it from Dana and from Kathleen and the monastery that were reflections of how they practice things. Ultimately, I've always thought of Druidry as being a reflection of ourselves, and you can really see this in how GCC has developed over time. In 2020, due to the fact that we had some members who were extremely interested in a more contemplative practice, a more monastic practice that was less ritualistic, the GCC monastery was created and has thrived over that time. They're very active within our community, doing healing meditations and prayers and contemplation and various. They're a very strong core group. And now in 2026, because of the demands of our very fast growing population of clergy, we're starting to explore more paths and specialties that will essentially support everybody's growth going forward. I've always said that, we have this rule of Awen that says it's our sacred duty to find and follow our own Awen, but that doesn't mean that you have to do it alone. So we've always tried to have some supports in place and some ability to communicate with each other, to share practices, to support one another. And as we've grown, we've seen a need for more subgroups within GCC because the one-on-one mentoring version that a lot of people are getting with me or the monastery or with Chris, who's our assistant preceptor now, is really hard to sustain once it gets to a certain size. We enjoy it very much, but as we go forward, we're going to have more subgroups such as community service. Obviously, the monastery is always going to be a part of that. Earth service and earth healing, and then also a path that we are calling the solitary practitioner right now, where Claire and I actually fall into, where it's essentially a religious development of AODA's practice. So your Bard practice, your Ovate practice, your Druid practice, and how that connects you to the divine or connects you to Awen. So there's going to be a lot of more information coming out about that in the future. And this workshop was part of that as a way to kind of familiarize people with the mechanics of the GCC Communion, kind of how it works, and so that they can then take those pieces and go off and make all sorts of new cool things that we can all share with each other and use together. Um, the rule of Awen, it says that you have a sacred duty to find and follow your own Awen. There's also a part of it that you don't interfere with others, Awen, and that means that we cannot have any sort of dogma. There are no, sacred things here that can't be touched or can't be changed, and that includes the communion ritual. And I think sometimes there's been some confusion about that just from people who think that they always have to do it, or they have to do it as written, or they have to, have it memorized or anything like that. And that's just not the case. This is an individualistic path, even when we're supporting others. So today we're going to talk about some ritual history, some occult philosophy. We're going to go through the communion ritual as it's written, the script of it, and break down the symbolism, the mechanics, and the intention of that so that you can see kind of how that symbolism, how that mythology, and how that intention is kind of draped around the mechanics to make it what it is. We're going to talk about some of the ways that other people have modified that ritual. And then hopefully by that point, knowing how the ritual works on an energetic level and on a symbolic level, you would be able to go and then wildcraft your own communion ritual if you would like to. The irony of this workshop is that Claire and I are both people who do the thing basically word for word and have for years.
All right. So, one of the things that I think happens because in our culture, communion is associated with Christianity, that people maybe don't realize. I didn't really realize, in fact, until I kind of started looking into this history, that it's a much older practice than just a Christian practice. So, interestingly enough, I think actually you can say is that the Christians basically borrowed a practice that they already knew about. and I'll kind of get into what that is. But communion itself, the way that we understand it, and the way that the ceremonies that the kind of the history of it as an idea and a practice, it's intended to be a blessing to nature and to all of life, blessing to um, the agricultural practices, to livestock, to farm crops, blessings to the human beings in the community, blessings to all the other animals and plants and beings of all kinds that the community uh, is connected to, both by the fact of where it is, so through its ecological connections, and also through its religious and cultural connections. So it is intended to be very much of a blessing, like I said, to all of nature, including humanity. A lot of different cultures have connected with the divine through shared food and offerings. Now that's the basic thing about communion, right? We get into communion, we have a food, bread, and we have a liquid, water and wine, and we are offering those. That is a very, very old practice, much predates Christianity. In fact, we know something about the history. If you want to read John Michael Greer's book, this is where I got most of this out of, The Secret of the Temple. There's a long history of tradition where temples were built in fairly similar ways through a very long period of time in many different cultures. And to the extent that we know about what those services were that they were doing, they all fall within this category. For instance, in Egypt, ancient Egypt, by what we know about around Middle Egyptian times, there were banquets. There was food prepared within temples under the supervision and with the participation of deity that was prepared by priests. And then the priests brought it out as a banquet to to everybody who was gathered around, and they shared it. So there was a sharing of food and drink between the beings that were venerated in the temples and the priests and the people. And they were intended toward agricultural fertility as well. So another example would be the Temple of Solomon. So particularly the Second Temple, which JMG talks quite a bit about. But again, this was an ancient Jewish temple. There was the same kind of thing going on. There was a temple of a particular design, and although the animals, like as with Egypt, there were animals that were sacrificed, but they were done outside of the temple. And within the temple, then you had other foods that were prepared under the supervision of the deity, and then shared among the priests and the deity, and then the people. Same thing happened in ancient Greece. So, and actually, once you know what happens in ancient Greece, that trails over into Roman times, and that probably is where the original Christian communion got picked up. But again, you had temples with festivals, and the festivals were both for a lot of festivals for agricultural fertility, but it was always done between priests and the deities and the people. Hindu temples, even to this day, Hindu temples are still built in this tradition, and they still have a lot of festivals that are where you have food and drink prepared by the priests, blessed by the gods, shared with the gods, and then shared with the priests and the people. Same thing in Shinto. That's also a continuing tradition. Now, there's also another tradition, which is interesting because it gets more into North America, but it's even more ancient because it goes back to ancient Babylon, which is the ziggurats. Ziggurats basically are like mud block or mud brick pyramids, and those also had an agricultural connection. We don't know that much about it, but if you take it over, somehow for some reason that particular tradition got over to the Americas rather than the temple tradition for whatever reason, we don't really know. But then you go down to Mayan, there's still apparently to this day down in the descendants of the Maya, they actually take seeds up to particular ziggurats, which is basically what the you see the pyramids and the Mayas, those are ziggurats. So they take the seeds, they take them up to the top of the temple, they expose them up at the top of the temple to the gods, and those seeds are blessed, and then they grow better in the cropland. And then that takes you over into the North American mounds. I happen to live 20 minutes from Cahokia Mounds, where you have Monk's Mound, which is the biggest mound in North America. And that was, we don't know anything about what they did at Cahokia, but you can sort of surmise from the design that it might have worked similarly because there was this humongous mound of earth, soil, with a building on top, and that is thought to be where priests were holding services. And they may very well have had this kind of service. They may not have. We don't really know, but it would follow. The temple tradition did decline in most places. Again, it really only lives on in Hindu temples and Shinto shrines, and these few examples in Central America that I mentioned. Eventually, the Roman Catholic communion service arose probably out of the Greek version of this tradition. But it's the same concept. Again, you have um, bread and wine, you have it in the presence of the divine, and it's shared between the divine and the people who are present. So here we talk about the commonalities between all these different festivals and communion, because once you break it down to the common elements, then there are a lot of commonalities. So the commonalities between all of these various festivals, first of all, you have a sacred building, which may have a particular design or may have some other different kind of design, but the important part of it is it's sacred to the deities, to the powers of the people of that community, and it's connected to the surrounding community. There's a lot of talk in The Secret of the Temple about the way that the grounds around the temples also are connected to the temple and the service. You have priests. We'll use priests as the sort of generic term for the people who are closest to the divine powers, who serve the divine powers through offerings of food and drink. And then they also share that food and drink with incarnate and discarnate life. So it's not just being shared with people because, as you know, like the whole Western idea that nature is pretty dead, that's a pretty unusual idea. Generally speaking, anybody else would have realized that they were also sharing it with the land, with the animals, with the plants, and they would all have been seen as participating in this ritual. And the whole point of this is bringing blessings upon the land and the people and the incarnate and discarnate beings through ritual actions. And you can see these exact commonalities in the GCC Communion service. The establishment of the temple, that's when we do the grove. So the grove for us, the grove comes out of a magical lodge tradition where you had to basically start with something fairly bare, a bare room. You didn't have a room that was completely your own. So you had to start with a bare room and then you had to bring in furnishings and set up the temple space, not just in the physical, but also in the astral. So that way you could set it up. You could just do the ritual, know that you are connected through the astral to the cosmos in general, and then take it down. So it is a temple. It's just a temple in astral space rather than in physical space, with some physical symbolism to, sort of help that out. So the establishment of the temple is when we set up the grove, when we open the grove. Once we open the grove, we invoke powers. Depending on, we invoke, I think one of the common elements is we invoke the four elements, but the powers that we invoke will depend on an individual's practice. Now, in the communion service, once you're done with that, so you've opened up the grove, you've invoked the powers. So now you have the divine presence and however, or the presence of the powers, however you envision them. At this point, with the communion service, you now bless an item of food and drink. And once you've blessed that, now you share it yourself with the divine, with the powers. And in the original communion service, at least, that also happens when you pour the wine back onto the land. That's sharing it with the land as well because it's still charged. Finally, after the ritual is completed, you release the temple by closing the grove. So the whole point of this, then, as you can see, it's the unification and the blessing of the whole of life. We don't leave anything out as Druids. The doctrine of one as part of the GCC, and again, you don't have to believe this. We just talk about it. We talk about it, but essentially, as it's set up, the GCC's history says that in some way, and you can leave that way very open to personal interpretation, there is a connection between all of us. That's really what the doctrine of one says at the end. And that's essentially through that connection, however you want to envision it, that we can establish the grove, we can invoke the powers, we can do the blessing, and then we can send that blessing out because it's extremely important that we send that blessing out in whatever way we do to whatever set of beings we're sending it out to. So one of the interesting things about the GCC communion as opposed to the Christian communion is that in the Christian communion you use wine, but in the GCC you have both wine and water. And there's a lot of symbolism that's incorporated into that, but one of the major points of symbolism is the red and the white dragon. And there are two dragons in a number of different places in the revival Druidry. So for instance, you have red and white dragons as being something like in feng shui, you have lower powers and higher powers. So essentially one of the dragons is kind of runs along ridge lines and the other dragon runs along valleys. But you also have that in alchemy where you have if I remember it correctly, it's the red king and the white queen that come together in the alchemical rituals. So you have that, you have two dragons relating in the tale of Merlin, where the boy Merlin finds out he prophesizes why the temple is falling down that they keep trying to build. And what it is it's two dragons in a pool fighting. There's also two dragons fighting in the story of, and I'm going to butcher this because I don't know Welsh, Lud and Lefelis in the Mabinogion, where you have one of the three plagues in Britain is two dragons that are fighting in the atmosphere and emitting terrible shrieks that are affecting fertility. So people can't have babies and the land isn't producing any food. And so what Lud does is he tames those two dragons. So that's where part of where this red and white dragon, the wine and the water comes from. Comes from a number of different places too. The red and the white springs at Glastonbury Tor and a few other places. So that's why you have wine and water as you're referring to particular symbolism that's common in revival Druid tradition. Now, of course, we establish the center when we're doing the water and when we're blessing the bread and the water wine, and establishing the lunar current once we've brought the telluric current into the bread and we've brought the solar current into the water and wine. Then we establish the lunar current, and it is that current, the lunar current, that we send out as a blessing to wherever it's going. Interestingly enough, once I read a little bit into the Ceremony of the Grail, another of John Michael Greer's books, and the Secret of the Temple, I realized just how much Arthurian symbolism really is part of all of this. So the Grail is very heavily symbolized, and Excalibur also in this particular original version of communion. But again, there's a common theme throughout mythology and human history. For instance, um, there is a connection of sovereignty, so kingship, to the health of the land in both Ireland and in Wales. I know a little bit more about Wales because I've read a bit about some of the early revival Druids writings. And Jack also reminds me that it's true in Ireland as well. But one of the things that the king is responsible for or sets up is he needs his kingship really um, is very much intertwined with the health of the land. If his kingship isn't working right, the land will not be healthy. So that's essentially also one of the symbolisms that this is drawing into. Now it's also drawing Caradwin's Cauldron, again, where you're setting up and making a water and herbal mix and using that to generate the lunar current that then Bach picks up and becomes Taliesin. And as I said, the Cauldron of Lud. Okay, Jax, yours.
All right, so we're going to go through the ritual mechanics of the original ritual so that you can kind of see how each of these things works and how the symbolism that was originally written into it kind of functions. And so we can really get kind of under the hood of the ritual and see how everything goes. But essentially, when we do the communion ritual, these are the pieces that we have. We have the declaration of peace, the purification of the grove, the invocation of the holy powers, the spear of protection. Then we have lection, and then we have the working itself, which is the communion, and then we have the closing of the ritual. So when we talk about declaring peace, this is a reference to a piece of history that was stated about the Druids. The historical record said that one of the traits of the Druids was that they could step in between two warring armies and declare peace, and that the armies would essentially lay down their weapons and they would avoid fighting because these Druids were so knowledgeable and respectful, and that is then symbolized within our ritual when we declare peace. Depending on how you do this, some like in the revival Druid tradition, a lot of times this is the sheathing and unsheathing of or the sheathing of a sword at each of the quarters. But some people will also just stand and raise their hand like they're essentially declaring peace, sort of like my Druid in my photo here. But this is beyond just declaring peace in terms of externally and radiating it out to the rest of the world. This is also the beginning of the ritual purification process. Almost universally, every ritual begins with some sort of purification and some sort of centering and focusing of the mind. And this is your first opportunity with in the ritual to do that. So when I say, you know, that the first duty of Druids gathered within the sacred grove is to proclaim peace, for without peace our work cannot proceed. I'm not just saying that I need peace around me externally with the people and society. I'm saying that there needs to be peace within me. I need to be at peace within myself and with the world. I need to silence the doubts. I need to silence the internal conflict that it would essentially inhibit me from being effective as a ritualist. So this is your first, banishing essentially of all the negative thoughts, all the mundane things and mundane worries, and all the things that are distractions, and focusing specifically on the work that you're about to do. Then we get to purification further in terms of the establishment of the cosmos on the altar. And when I talk about the cosmos in AODA sense, I'm really talking about the elements because that's the cosmological core of the AODA system is essentially our seven elements. The air, fire, water, earth, the spirit above, below, and within. And the altar is essentially a microcosmic representation of the cosmos. And this is a common thing throughout a lot of different traditions. If you know what you're looking for and you look at an altar for almost any sort of religious practice, you can almost see how that person establishes the cosmos, whether it's the elements in our case, but in or it's deity statues, or say in EDF Druidry where they have the fire and the well and the tree. All of that is essentially a microcosmic representation of the larger cosmos. Uh, so during the purification, we get up, we take our representations of air, fire, water, and earth, and we take them out to each of the quarters, and we allow the energies that we invoke from those elements to fill those symbols so that they essentially become those things, right? They're energetically aligned with those things. And then we circumambulate the grove with those items as in order to purify it and essentially consecrate that space. And then we bring it to the altar, and we essentially have a tiny universe on our altar that contains all of the elements of our cosmos, right? So all of you are, know that we have the cauldrons for the air and the fire and the water and the earth. But, what about the spirits above and below? Well, that's where the bread and wine come into play within the communion ritual. The bread is symbolic of the telluric current. So that's our cosmological representation of the spirit below. If you're familiar with the Druid elements, then Kalas will be familiar to you. If you're not, then I'll just describe the three elements that we work with sometimes in Revival Druidry as being Kalas, Guyar, and Nuivra. So Kalas is structure, right? It's like solidity, it's rigidity, and we can see the bread as being symbolic of that, as well as the winter solstice. In the liturgy the if you do it by the book, it talks about the buried grain of winter, and that is how we're essentially referencing the winter solstice within the ritual. The wine itself is representative of the solar current, but also Guyar, which I misspelled, I think, in the slide there, but it's actually GWYAR, and the summer solstice. So Guyar is fluidity. So without fluidity, structure becomes stagnant, it becomes lifeless. Without structure, fluidity is essentially just chaos. And sometimes you'll actually see this referred to within some traditions as chaos and order. Chaos and order have to balance each other. Chaos keeps order essentially flexible and changing, and but without order, chaos just goes everywhere. It can't be harnessed towards any actual work. The the water is the white dragon current that we had talked about earlier, and the reunification of those two together is essentially symbolic of the completion of the great work within alchemy, which the great work was essentially the purification of the self and the reunification with the divine. And we can see that also within the lunar current, which is the balance between the bread as the winter solstice, and the wine as the summer solstice. The lunar current and the balance between them is Nuivra, which is spirit, it's life force. It's sometimes described as like the force in Star Wars if you're like that, that type of geek, and I kind of am. I'll at some point I'll probably show you my replica Excalibur sword that I have sitting here next to me for that I use for my rituals. Uh, but the lunar current is also the equinox, right? The two equinox. It's the balance between the two extremes. You can see this same balance within the three rays of light that, depending on tradition, are named different things, but one of them is like knowledge, power, and then peace in between them. the third ray is always the reconciliation of the extremes of the two rays, just like the three rays are a representation of the position of the sun at the extremes of the solstice and the balance of the equinox. In revival Druid philosophy, whenever we talk about Kalas, Guyar, and Nuivra, we're talking essentially about the elements that are responsible for all things, that all things are different levels of these things. All things have all three of these things, just like they have the four elements of air, fire, water, and earth, just like they have the spirit above and below and within. This is essentially in revival Druidry representation of the cosmos as it is. So then we move into the invocation of powers. So in the original opening, even if you did nothing else, then you could do this universally through the Druid's prayer, the grant, O Holy Ones, thy protection and thy protection strength, etc. Um, Whenever you're saying that, you're essentially inviting the holy powers of nature. You're inviting the deities that you work with, the divine, and however you conceptualize it, to join you at this altar. We'll talk later about other ways you can bring in specific deities to your own theology or other elements of other traditions to kind of work with this. But we're inviting these powers in to help us with this work. We're asking for their blessing upon the ritual itself. And you'll see this in a lot of various traditions that often begin a ritual with a prayer to the divine in some ways, or in some ways the invocation of the divine prior to getting to the working of the ritual. Because at this point we're still in the opening. We, part of religion oftentimes is that we understand that there's powers greater than us, and that when we perform ritual, we're asking for their blessing, we're asking for their assistance to kind of help us get through this ritual, to help us achieve the things that we're trying to achieve. So the next piece is using the SOP, and this is to establish sacred space and connect to the macrocosm. So you have a lot of different ways of creating sacred space and sacred time in various cultures and in various traditions. The SOP is just a very convenient way of doing that because most of us practice it every day. But the best way to think about how it functions to me, or at least in my opinion, is, as they say, ask five different druids, get seven different answers, right? Um, but is to think of what the elements represent in terms of time and space and everything else, right? Each of your elements is a direction. East is not or air is not only air, but it's also east. It's also morning. It's also spring. So whenever I am invoking the element of air, I'm invoking I'm essentially invoking that direction. I'm invoking the energies of that time of day, of that season. Also, at that point in my life, I'm invoking the energies of essentially like birth, right? Um, and when we've made it around throughout the entire piece of the SOP, we're in the middle of all space because we're in the middle of all the directions. We're in the middle of all time because we're in the middle of a symbolic year, a symbolic day, a symbolic lifetime, right? So there's this concept within occultism that all sacred space is essentially connected, that all sacred time is connected. So whenever you do the SOP, you're doing the SOP with me. You're doing the SOP with Claire. You're doing it with 3,000 other AODA druids who have done this, and however many thousand have done this before. And in terms of the web of existence and like the energetic web of life, we're all connected in that space. And since all sacred time is connected, not only are you connecting to every time I've done these things, you're connecting to every time you've done these things. So depending on how you want to look at it, either with, I always call either you do the rings of a tree or an onion, right? Every time you do the SOP, you're putting another layer on that onion. Every time you do the SOP, you're adding another ring to the tree that is AODA Druidry. And over time, you could actually, if you're sensitive to energy in a space, you can feel how that energy changes the rooms that you're in, the places that you're in, and how it changes you, right? How it balances you. So we are building essentially the cosmos around us on different levels. We've got it on our altar, we've got it around us, and that connects us to the larger macrocosm itself, to the universe itself, to existence, right? On every plane of existence, whether physical, spiritual, mental, whatever tradition, however, whatever tradition lays out those things for you. Uh, and because of that, we're essentially reenacting the creation of all things, of the universe, of existence, even. And when we connect to that creative energy, we can direct it. And that is essentially the core of magic, and especially within SOP-based systems, such as from the Dolmen Arch, the Druid Magic Handbook, the Fellowship of the Hermetic Rose, various other sister traditions to AODA. So we're using that creative energy in this case to connect to all things and then to radiate the blessing out to all things along essentially this web of connection that we all share. So once we're connected, we sit within lection. And lection is our version of essentially meditation or clearing the mind, that you'll see in various ways. This is done in various ways in various traditions. But what you're trying to do is essentially bridge the conscious and the subconscious mind through relaxation and through your meditative intention by focusing your mind upon the intent of your ritual, whether that's the blessing or the connection, or depending on what you're reading, you're focusing all of that creative energy that you've now built up, all that web of stuff, and you're focusing it on a single thing. You're clearing your mind of all the distractions. You're focused on exactly what you're doing. If you're in a group, this is a very important thing because this is how you set up what's some people will call the group mind. Your group rituals will work much better if everybody's essentially thinking along the same lines. So you can establish that through a essentially a guided meditative journey or meditation upon a common theme or using common imagery that everybody's essentially focused on. But we're essentially establishing a liminal state so that we can work on multiple levels of existence. While you do your physical ritual on the physical plane, you're performing this same ritual on other levels of existence, and that's why you have an impact beyond just your physical place. So within the actual communion piece of this, which is essentially, if you were thinking magically, is essentially the working of this ritual, there's a lot of Druid philosophy here, especially revival Druid philosophy. And some of this, if you're not familiar with it, may seem pretty foreign. So one of the things that's mentioned in the liturgy is Obred, Gwynfydd, and Cygant. So Obrid is essentially the physical world, your physical realm. Gwynfydd is the spiritual realm, and Kaigan is the divine realm. So the if you think of these in terms of like circles of existence, how they're often like charted out, part of this ritual is to bridge Abrid and Gwynfydd so that you're, like I mentioned, you're operating on the spiritual realm and the physical realm. You're unifying your conscious and subconscious, your spiritual and physical life, and therefore putting yourself in contact with the divine in Kaigan. Uh, you could think of this in terms of the one that we talk if you're familiar with Hermetic philosophy or if you've read any of that, like the Kabbalion and things like that for some of our curriculum. But you could also think about it just in terms of energetic webs that connect all things, right? That all things influence each other or connected each other in some possible way. So when we talk about in the presence of the one with the helps of the powers, what we're really talking about is the presence of the whole system or the all, if you see it that way, or how everything is connected. We're recognizing that we're connected to all things in that moment. There's an optional personal prayer that's always inserted in there, and you can use that however you like. It I have a set of prayers that I'll usually throw in there. Sometimes it'll be something specific to the moment. But a lot of times if we're doing this, like if the Archdruids are doing this together, we just go on to the invocation of the powers. But so then we ask the holy powers of nature for their assistance in blessing the bread and the wine, so that we can manifest the lunar current. Uh, and you can see that we essentially, like as it's written, we say, uh, you know, we'll offer the bread to the heart of the earth. So, like Claire said, we're offering it to the divine first, and then as a result of that, they are then blessing it, or the Telluric current is then blessing that with the power of the earth, in essentially reciprocity for that, right? Once we have established the solar current and the telluric current within the bread and the wine, we combine them together to manifest the lunar current. And that, as soon as those powers join, radiates out across the land, to bless all of life, right? To as because in that moment everything is connected all at once. And then you ingest that and you are connected with everything all at once. Sometimes will tell people that for me, communion makes me feel a little bit like an antenna, like I can pick up on all things, right? And that's one of the benefits of the communion ritual is that it's a ritual of unity and connection. There's a lot of people that have written about the idea that in modern life we've essentially separated ourselves from the divine, or we've separated ourselves from nature, and as a result of that, we suffer from a lot of of feelings of disconnect and a feeling of restlessness that that we're missing something within our lives. That part of the communion ritual is the idea that you're reconnecting with those things and you can feel the flows and cycles of nature. You're more aware of the connection between things, and as a result, you've restored one of those things that we miss in modern society whenever we saw the decline of temple culture. So having completed the working, I'll tell you that after I eat the bread, I usually sit in an open meditation for a while because I like to just sit there and kind of buzz and just kind of let myself you know, feel everything for a little bit, let it bake in a little bit. Um, and then we move to the closing. So the first thing we do in the closing is we release the powers of the elements to their rightful place. And we also say, may peace prevail within the quarters. So we're saying that even though that we're taking down this grove, we want peace to continue throughout our lives and throughout our influence, essentially. So the microcosm itself, in terms of those elemental representations, are all released. Then we take the energy from the spear itself and we send that into the earth, for a blessing as well. So you know, we're sending that connection to the macrocosm, all the energy we've raised into the earth as an additional blessing, which is part of why if you do this in the same place repeatedly, you can start, a lot of times people say that it feels a little different in that space. And then the temple and the is disassembled and sacred space is released. And I say released-ish because in Druidry, we don't necessarily have that strict divide of sacred and mundane space because all nature is sacred, right? The area that been doing this in for the last decade is, has residual energy from this. So the temple essentially always exists because the temple is essentially me, right? And that's something that they'll talk about with the Temple of King Solomon and things like that. It's that a lot of these temples are a representation, of the individual themselves. So then we come to the Sword of Swords, and this is probably the piece the of the ritual that I get the most questions about because it's all of a sudden Excalibur's there, just sort of out of nowhere, right? Um, and so if you think about Excalibur, it was a symbol of power and authority and sovereignty within the Arthurian legends. This is the sword that essentially gave King Arthur his right to rule, right? It's also associated within some of the mythology as with the Lady of the Lake, who's essentially tied to as is essentially a sovereignty goddess and the land, and goes back to that idea that in order for a king to be true and just, they had to earn the favor of the land itself, right? They're connected to the health and energy of the land. In fact, there's if you read The Wasteland, it's about how the land kind of dwindles at the end of King Arthur's reign, whenever it starts when there starts being some uh, camel some falling happening in Camelot, so they would say. The This is the Sword of Swords is also symbolic of the lunar current. So you've got they would talk about the fire of the sun, the steel of the earth, and the craft of the wise as being the things that form this. So you're talking about the solar current and the telluric current and the lunar current that has to be manifested with intention. So the craftsman of the sword has essentially manifested this. You could also there's also references to three rays of light. So we talk about the three rays of light, the three stones of witness, and the three Rowan staves of knowledge. This is Alwyn, and then the stones that it essentially shines off of. But then the Rowan staves within Revival Druid mythology is where all the knowledge from Alwyn was transcribed onto staves. And that had to be done by the intention of the wise, right? So again, you're talking about, you know, that not only do we have to have inspiration, not only do we have to have the living earth as cooperation, but we as practitioners, as druids, have to then take that intention and do good things with it. It's also symbolic of following your Awen because Excalibur was symbolic of Arthur's journey, of his purpose to set up Camelot, to have the quest for the Grail, to do all these things. So Excalibur itself, within the ritual, could be seen as essentially your Awen. So when you talk about pledging your service to the living earth on essentially the Sword of Swords on Excalibur, you're pledging service to the living earth, like you would pledge service as a knight to a realm or to a king. The Grail's symbolism gets tied to the lunar, solar, and telluric currents as well, within some of these rituals that are connected to this and some traditions that are connected to this. One of those is that essentially that you have three cauldrons within you. In our tradition, we may call that the cauldron of earth, the cauldron of the sun, and the cauldron of the moon. And if you, with the cauldron of the earth as a symbol, it's sort of like a triangle. The cauldron of the sun is a symbol that's sort of like a circle like that. And the cauldron of the moon is like a crescent like that. If you stack them all together, it essentially looks like a cup. So whenever what we're essentially pledging is to go on our own quest, and that's the quest for our Awen. There's this quote in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade that I've always liked, and I really couldn't find a better quote to kind of like sum it up. So I just decided to take it. So that's why we have Indy down there about to drink from the cup in that movie. But it said Marcus tells Indy in that movie that the search for the Grail is the search for the divine in all of us. And that's essentially what we're aspiring to with this ritual and with that pledge to find and follow our own Awen is to find the divine within ourself and to follow that to our higher self, which is symbolized in the ritual by the spiritual sun, which is essentially what the sword becomes. Depending on on your practice, you may have a real sword or a not real sword. I've got my big Excalibur right here that that is a lot bigger than it looked like it was on the internet, but I use it in my practice as being my representation of the Sword of Swords. At least sometimes, whenever I feel like getting it out and potentially taking out my ceiling fan. So at the core of the ritual, what we're really talking about, if we strip everything away, we're creating sacred space according to the cosmology that we're using. And that doesn't have to be our cosmology, right? It could be draped in your own cosmology or in another tradition or another religious practice. But you're essentially creating that sacred space to mimic the cosmos as you see it. We're centering and focusing the mind on the intention of the ritual. We got to get all those distractions out so you can direct all of your energy, all your thoughts towards one thing. That's not easy to do, and it's something that you'll get better at over time. But that's at least the idea. I struggle with not thinking about work or the things I have to do sometimes anyway. And then I'll usually have my dog sitting around waiting to try to get a bite of the bread after communion anyway. So there's a lot of distractions. Uh, the ritual will have the invocation of powers to assist us with what we're doing, and then the drawing of powers above and below, whether you're thinking of them as earth and sky or any number of other things in order to empower your intention and then taking those powers into yourself, but more importantly, radiating the blessing of the powers out to the rest of the earth, to the rest of existence. Because that's really, and I'll credit Claire with this because Claire's the one that said it one day, is that if that's really the difference between communion and the SOP. If you think of the SOP is essentially a blessing to yourself for the most part. It's protecting you, it's centering you. The communion ritual is really about that, taking that and then radiating that blessing out away from you to all its people, to take it into the world with you. And I think that's part of the reason that the Sword of Swords is actually after the closing of the ritual, right? We've already released sacred space. We're now, swearing our allegiance to the living earth. We're doing that not within the sphere of protection, not within the elements, but within our lives, right? Because it's it's not only what we do within that grove, but how it's manifested in what we do in our actions towards the earth, towards each other, the things that we do in our mundane life, because in reality, there is no mundane life. There's only us. There you go. So, what do you do with all this information if you want to try something different? Uh, and there's a lot of different ways that you can essentially do this because the only limitation is really going to be your own imagination. You can utilize your own cosmology, you can utilize your own theological beliefs. I will use a lot of times Irish deities because that's a large part of my practice, or I'll invoke ancestors and nature in addition to that. But it can really work with any kind of cosmology, any kind of theology. You can take the other mythological frameworks and then apply them to the same work. You can use, uh, instead of like the King Arthur stuff, you could easily use stuff from the Mabinogian or from Irish mythology or Norse mythology or Christian symbolism or any number of other things. uh, Symbol and myth is a lot of times is an allegory uh, for more universal truths, right? And this, you essentially can take anything like that, as long as you know what the symbols mean, you can build them around the core of this ritual and really make it yourself. And that includes switching out the bread and wine for things that reflect your culture, your practice, your life, the things that work for you, right? The as long as you remember at the core that there's you essentially have three intentions here. One is connecting to all life. One is then blessing all that life, and one is following your own awe and advancing yourself mystically and spiritually. You really can't go wrong with this. This is just a suggested framework to essentially start with. So some examples of additions or modifications that I've seen in versions of communion that people have sent to me in the past is the addition of ritual gestures. The top example here is actually from Branos, who many of you may know, who's has a very Gaulish practice and has created essentially a Gaulish version of communion that builds upon this. And in some of these cases, like unless you are looking for the core of the practice, it would be hard to even recognize them as the same rituals, right? They're invoking the same powers, they're involving the same things, they're accomplishing the same things, but they may look entirely different. Dana, who's is the one that's responsible for the second one here, rather than doing lection with a book, whenever she does her communion ritual, she actually spends time observing nature. She considers it to be the book of nature, and then depending on what her observation is, then she does her meditation on that versus writing. Dana also versus doesn't use bread and wine, but instead channels the energies into a tree and then radiates that out through, essentially through the soil. Uh, you can give offerings to deities rather than just the currents and let them take their part of the offerings. Deities, or like I said, ancestors, or just whatever you consider to be the sacred within your practice. Um, I mentioned Dana, she radiates the blessing along the natural network within the soil and the mushrooms and everything like that in order to radiate the blessing out. Um, I've seen like Takina does an invocation of her ancestors and utilizes native language as part of that practice. A lot of people, whenever they do the SOP or just any kind of elemental, they'll use the elemental work. They'll have deities they associate with the elements, and they'll invoke the elements in the name of those deities. So, for example, whenever I invoke the spirit of below during communion, I will usually invoke Danu as being the Earth Mother as part of that. The real suggestion is just try something. And if it doesn't resonate with you, yeah, try something else. And if something does resonate with you, keep that, but then don't keep the other parts that don't work. Uh, you can really be creative with this, and there's nothing wrong with saying, well, that one wasn't great, but let's try something else next time. This is a lifetime practice. You don't want to get stuck in something that doesn't feel right to you. So, make some modifications. And if you have a group, you can get an entire group involved. Nothing says that one person has to do every step of communion. When the archdruids get together, sometimes we'll each invoke a different element, or we'll do a different part of the ritual. Um, and then some people, Claire and I guess, love doing the ritual as written word by word. Um, and that's cool too. You don't have to feel free to change things if memorization's your thing, and if you just like the way it runs. But if there's any part of it that doesn't seem right to you, I encourage people to work on that and start trying a few different things. I'm going to stop our recording here.